Okay, Vice, we're already live in YouTube. Let's begin the poll. Okay.
Mm.
Right. Good evening from Mexico City. Good morning, good afternoon to our participants from all over the world, and welcome to the ninth episode of La Historia Olvidada, Filipinas, Mexico, 2025. Before we begin, I'd like to lay out some gentle house rules and reminders. We would like to kindly request that the video cameras and microphones of all participants in Zoom be disabled throughout the program and presentation. After our speaker's presentation, we will have an open forum wherein everyone is encouraged to ask questions or provide their comments. Participants may also state or write their questions in the chat box here in Zoom or in YouTube. Participants are also invited to fill out the evaluation form, which will be shared at the end of the session. With that said, I'd like to call on His Excellency Arvin R. De Leon, Ambassador of the Philippines to Mexico, to deliver his welcome remarks. Sir?
Yeah. Thank you, NJ. Good evening from Mexico, and good morning and good afternoon to our participants from the Philippines and other parts of the world. On behalf of the Philippine Embassy in Mexico, I warmly welcome everyone to the ninth episode of La Historia Olvidada, Filipinas, Mexico 2025. We are grateful to be joined once again by colleagues from academic institutions in the Philippines and Mexico, members of the diplomatic corps, colleagues from the Philippine and Mexican governments, and other members, colleagues from the Philippine Foreign Service posts, Philippine honorary consuls, and members of the Filipino communities under our jurisdiction. To those who are tuning in via our YouTube channel, maraming salamat, muchas gracias, and bienvenidos. It is a pleasure to be with you this evening, what marks my second official event as Ambassador Designate of the Philippines to Mexico, countries in Central America, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic since assuming my post last October 17. Yesterday, the embassy hosted a mini concert and singing workshop with Dr. Ramon Acoimo as part of our activities for the commemoration of the 460th anniversary of the Manila-Acapulco Galleon Trade Route, one of the most significant legacies of our shared history with Mexico. The event served as a reminder that our common past continues to inspire meaningful exchanges, whether in culture, education, or diplomacy, between the peoples of the Philippines, Mexico, and the wider region. Tonight's episode of La Historia Olvidada, Filipinas, Mexico holds a special significance as we also celebrate the second anniversary of this virtual lecture series. Over the past 2 years, La Historia Olvidada has become an important platform for rediscovering and celebrating the intertwined histories of our countries that connect not only the Philippines and Mexico, but also the nations of Asia, Americas, and Europe, and share in this rich heritage born from centuries of trans-Pacific exchange. For our first-time participants, La Historia Olvidada Filipinas Mexico is a virtual colloquium series on Philippine-Mexico relations launched on 17 October 2023 by the Philippine Embassy in Mexico in collaboration with the University of the Philippines Diliman, El Colegio de San Luis, and the Philippines-Mexico Philippine Studies Program based at the UNA. The series aims to highlight pivotal events and contexts that have shaped the engagements between the Philippines and Mexico, spanning from the 16th century to the present. It also seeks to promote deeper academic, diplomatic, and cultural exchanges between the Philippines and Mexico, while underscoring the significance of the Manila-Acapulco Gulf trade and its role in early globalization. This evening, we are deeply honored to have Dr. Fernando Encialcita, Professor Emeritus from the University Ateneo de Manila University, and by the way, my former professor as well in social anthropology, as our resource speaker. His presentation, Mixed Unions During the Spanish Period, Facts and Fictions, offers valuable insights into how intercultural encounters and social integration shaped both Philippine and Latin American societies under the Spanish Empire. His work reminds us that the connections between our regions extend far beyond trade. They include shared values, blended cultures, and a long history of human interaction. As we continue to build upon these historical foundations, may La Historia Olvidada serve as a bridge that connects the past with the present, strengthening the academic, cultural, and people-to-people ties among Philippines, Mexico, and the other countries under this embassy's jurisdiction. To all our participants, partners, especially to Dr. Tomas Calillo of El Colegio de San Luis, our co-organizer of this evening's episode, and viewers online who continue to support this meaningful initiative, I extend my heartfelt appreciation. Your commitment ensures that the friendship between our nations remains vibrant and enduring. Without further ado, I invite NJ, our political and economic attaché, to formally introduce our distinguished resource speaker for this evening. Maraming salamat po. Muchas gracias a todos. Mabuhay.
Thank you very much po, Ambassador De Leon. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce our resource speaker for today's session. Dr. Fernando Zialcita earned his bachelor's degree in humanities and master's in philosophy from the Ateneo de Manila. He has a master's and PhD in anthropology from the University of Hawaii, where he explored the intersection of Hispanic and indigenous identities in art, politics, and religion. He co-authored The Philippine Ancestral Houses, 1810 to 1930. He also co-edited Quaresma, Lenten Beliefs and Practices. He wrote authentic, though not exotic, essays on Filipino identity in 2025 and Insular Yet Global in 2024. He chaired the Council on Asia Pacific Latin America Studies from 2012 to 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Fernando Zialcita. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. First, I would like to greet Ambassador Arvin De Leon. Thank you for your new post. Thank you for alluding to the fact that we know each other in Ateneo. I would like to thank also former ambassador to the Philippines, Tomas Calvillo, for suggesting my name. I would like to thank also former ambassador to Mexico, Lilibeth de Apelo, and Cristina Baron for starting the series. And would like to salute also Ricardo Pinzon for his continuing research on the genetic linkages between the Philippines and Mexico. Okay, now let me share with you my PowerPoint. I decided to talk about mixed unions during the Spanish period, facts versus fiction. There has been a lot of misunderstanding about this in the Philippines, and I think this has damaged our appreciation of who we are. So it really is time to clarify this. I have to contribute to this clarification. So my question is, why is it that in Asia we stand out for accepting as natural mixed unions? For example, we take unions like this for granted. This is a famous singer and dancer, Sara Geronimo, and an actor, Matteo Guidicelli. He's of Italian descent, first generation, as the name suggests. We take this for granted as normal in the Philippines. Not so. This is not the case in our other Southeast Asian neighbors. Are leaders of mixed ancestry, Chinese and native, acceptable in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar? Cardinal Jaime Sin is actually a first-generation Filipino because his father was a migrant from Fujian, the mother from Panay. Corazon Cojuangco Aquino is of native stock on her mother's side. Her mother was Andrea Sumulong. Her father, however, came from a line of Chinese migrants to the Philippines, Ko. In fact, there's an ancestral temple in Fujian which inscribes their lineage. I think she's Chinese. Her Chinese ancestry dates back 4 generations ago. They were able to mobilize millions of people against Marcos easily during the last years of the Marcos regime. When they were mobilizing people, people didn't even take a look at their ancestry. It was of no consequence to Filipinos. What was important was that they gave voice to the aspirations of millions of Filipinos. Per Evelyn Hu Dehart, a Chinese American scholar at Brown University, she says that in Southeast Asia, this can only happen in the Philippines. Dr. Evelyn Hu Dehart has been exploring the role of the Chinese in the Spanish Empire, whether in the Philippines or in Spanish America. Just to complicate the issue, the Aranetas and Rojas are both of Spanish descent. The Rojas, originally the Rojas were descended from a sea captain, Pedro Rojas, who manned one of the one of the galleons rather, traveling from Acapulco. Um, Pedro Rojas settled in the Philippines, and then he um, he eventually made a good business out of supplying equipment to ships. Now, they intermarried, and this is Mar Rojas, very popular political leader. And this is another, yeah, this is Mar Rojas. Is he Chinoy? Is he Chinese? Is he Spanish or Filipino? Filipinos don't even think of this. They just look at him as one of our own. Now, for comparison, I used to go into Indonesia a lot in the 1990s and early 2000s because I would monitor the field work of my Indonesian students. They told me that even a seventh generation Indonesian Chinese is still regarded as Chinese. In the 1998 riots following the fall of Suharto, mobs attacked anyone who looked Chinese, including Muslim Indonesians who looked fair but had no Chinese ancestry. Well, I'll tell you this. Traveling around Indonesia, it was easy to spot who had indeed Chinese ancestry because there are no gradations. Unlike in Manila or other Philippine cities, there are gradations. So it's hard to tell who exactly is of Chinese ancestry and who is not. Now in Malaysia, the people are divided into four ethnic categories: Malay, Muslim. They're called Bumiputra sons of the land. Chinese, Indian, indigenous. Privileges are given to the first to protect their status. So if you're Chinese, you don't have the same privileges as the Malay. Now, where do Malaysians of Portuguese Malay descent fit? I'm not sure about this, but Portuguese Malaysians are very important also, at least in Malacca. Now, in Singapore today, there are four ethnic categories: Chinese, Indian, Malay, and others. Others would include those of European, largely Portuguese, largely Portuguese, and native descent. Um, in Singapore right now, if you're born of Chinese father, you are required to learn the language of your father. Indian, the language of your father, and Malay, of course. Yeah. For others, I'm not so sure about the policy, but as you can see, this idea of mixing that we take for granted in the Philippines is not necessarily the case in other Southeast Asian countries. So here are the topics. As an anthropologist, I'm interested in race, culture, and mixed unions. For comparison, I think we should take a look at the Anglo-American policy on mixed unions. Then I'm bringing the question of Manila as global city during the galleon trade. Would this be the reason why mixed unions are accepted? Or should we go much deeper? What was the Spanish policy in the first place on mixed unions? And I would like to close by asking, what term should we use? Mestizo, hybrid, or a term I'm exploring now, polymodal? And then I have takeaways and recommendations to make. So let's explore basic concepts in anthropology about race and culture. Race and culture are not the same. Race Actually, Tentkatel, I hope you can comment on this too later because you're a biological anthropologist. Race is consists actually variations within a species that are adaptations. For example, the white skin and brown hair of I hate to use the term Caucasoids are an adaptation to the insufficient sunlight in the northern hemisphere, while dark skin is more adaptable to the equatorial belt. Traditionally, this is the way races have been classified: Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, Melano-Australian. But I understand that this classification is outdated now. Now, what I just wanted to point out is that from anthropologist's perspective, marriage across racial lines is not unnatural. It doesn't cause abnormalities because we all belong to only one species, not one race, as usually said, one species, Homo sapiens sapiens. Now, on the other hand, what is culture? Culture is actually a construct. It's a system made up by human beings. It's generally it's proper only to the human species. It's a system of symbols that makes thinking and communication possible. Now, our most important system of symbols is language. So no other animal species has language, only we have. We also have technology that enables human beings to make use of their physical environment. So fire, weapons, containers, clothes are all examples of technology. Culture is dynamic. It influences other cultures. It is also influenced by other cultures. So intercultural mixing is the most natural thing for anthropologists. So both are natural. However, many of our Asian neighbors, like many of those raised in the Anglo-American world, still tend to view both as unnatural. There's that lingering suspicion. I just want to point out that in Spanish, Portuguese, and French influenced countries, there's race prejudice. Of course, that cannot be denied. But interracial unions have long been regarded as normal when celebrated either in church or, in the case of French influenced countries, before a secular court. So let's take a look at the Anglo American tradition because this is what is most familiar now to Filipinos. Originally, when the British and the Dutch established presence overseas, they were not really interested in conversion to Christianity. The British were interested in trade, and so were the Dutch. So missionizing was quite late, whereas in the Spanish Empire started uh, in the 1500s, in the British Empire in the late 18th century only, towards the close. So likewise was the case in Dutch East Indies, or what we call Indonesia. There were also legal prohibitions on mixed marriages. In fact, in the United States until the 1950s, there was segregation. And we know for a fact that there was deliberate extermination of non-whites in 19th century Australia. This is pointed out repeatedly by Australians. For example, if you go to Melbourne Museum, you will see constant reminders about this. So down to the 1950s, there were US counties prohibiting interracial marriages. Some more intense, some more less intense. So there was this segregation in terms of facilities where you could drink, where you can sit in buses. So hypodescent is a concept we anthropologists use to point out that actually a person's racial and ethnic category are determined solely by an ancestor's membership in a subordinate racial and ethnic category. It is used to punish descendants of mixed unions. It's still alive in the US, despite the fact that there are no more strictures on interracial marriages. This is what anthropologists nickname the one drop rule. So if you have just one drop of black African blood, you're still considered black African. It comes across, for example, in the case of President Obama. He's actually of mixed ancestry. His mother is pure white. She was my classmate, by the way, University of Hawaii. And here is Obama. His father was Indonesian. I'm sorry, his father was Afro American, but is one half white, one half black. He was raised in Kansas, in the house of his mother's relatives, but is considered black. Why? Or take the case of Kamala Harris, white, black, colored. She's constantly referred to as a black vice president. In the Spanish context, she would simply be called mestiza. Um, I just want to point out that in the 1930s, when the Nazis in Germany were contemplating laws that would isolate Jews in Germany, they actually sent a mission to the US to review the laws in the Deep South as a model for the laws they would enact. This has been documented, by the way, um, in scholarly articles. Now, the terms in English are really awful. Half breed, half caste, half blood. So Harry Potter has a novel called Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. It sounds very insulting, actually, though it may not be unintended. Why half-blood? The worst is, of course, mongrel. In other words, you're a mixture of everything. So you're nothing at all. So how about new terms or I wouldn't say new terms, but terms that are being floated around right now. I notice a hybrid has gained currency even among Spanish language writers, híbrido. Uh, the problem I have with híbrido or hybrid is that if you consult Spanish language dictionaries like the Diccionario de la Real Academia Española or standard dictionaries like Merriam-Webster, one of the possible definitions is that it means an offspring of parents of two different species, therefore unnatural. So it's actually quite insulting. Biracial it's a problem because um it, because look, Filipinos and Chinese technically come from the same race, but they come from two different ethnic groups. So are you going to call a Chinese Filipino marriage biracial? It doesn't make sense. Eurasian, by the way, sounds so neutral. It is not. Formerly, in many Asian countries, it also connoted bastardy. So, what about Filipinos when they speak of themselves? Unfortunately, since the 1950s, uneducated Filipinos not familiar with Spanish keep using the terms mongrel and bastard to describe who we are. Now, now, could the acceptance of mixing in the Philippines as normal be due to the fact that Manila was a global city during the galleon trade? So let's take a look at Manila as a global city during the galleon trade. So the galleon trade, which actually began in Cebu, 1565, and was later transferred to Manila as its hub in the Philippines, was actually the first global trade enterprise that linked the continents together. It lasted for 250 years. The hubs were Manila in Asia and Acapulco, Mexico City in the Americas. So the trade connected Asia to the Americas and eventually to Spain because goods were also transshipped to Spain. So there was a special connection between Manila and Acapulco, as we all know. Now, goods came from all over Asia. So Spanish silver pesos minted in Mexico were exchanged in Manila for goods from all over Asia and the Philippines. According to David Irving, British musical historian, uh, Manila was the world's first global city. So here are textiles loaded on board the galleons from China, kimonos from Japan, uh, cotton cloth from Ilocos, and one of the most precious items was, of course, muslin from India. The valued currency, a currency that became legal all over the world at the time, was the Spanish ocho real, silver pesos minted in Mexico. So Pedro Murillo Velarde, Jesuit, noted this of Manila in 1749. He says that if you stand on a bridge connecting Manila to Binondo, the walled city to Binondo, in other words, the trading center, there are these people you can see passing by, crossing the bridge. He enumerates them. I'll just sum it up. So in other words, blacks from Asia, Chinese, some of them Christians, most pagans. There are also people from different parts of what is now Indonesia, and Japanese, Borneans, Timorese, Bengalis, people from Mindanao, Malays, Javanese, peoples from other parts of Asia, peoples from the different nations of Europe, peoples from the different kingdoms of Spain and from all of the Americas. He says you would never have such an opportunity in any other city in the entire Spanish monarchy and would find it difficult to have it in any other part of the globe. That bridge is now Jones Bridge. I wish there would have a marker citing the significance of that bridge. Um, so Pedro Murillo Velarde was the first to, to, to construct a map showing all of the Philippines as we know it today. Um, he had his map decorated with vignettes on the sides, this showing the different peoples or some of the different peoples you could see in Manila of that period. Joaquin Martinez de Zuniga, Augustinian, writing in 1803, said that Manila is around 100,000 inhabitants. He was referring, of course, not to Manila as we see today, but just specifically the walled city or Intramuros. So he cites the fact that Spaniards, cites mestizos. I think this is a wrong translation. At that time, in the 18th, 19th centuries, when people used mestizo, they meant actually Chinese Filipino. The native Filipinos, Chinese, Armenians, English, French, and other nationalities that because there's hardly any kind of people in the world which is not represented here. So let's take a look now at the Hispanic Latin tradition to clarify what is going on. First caution is that we have to be careful about getting our materials only from British and Dutch authors. They created the narrative in the 16th century that Spaniards were extraordinarily cruel. They deliberately created a black legend against Spain, Leyenda Negra. The British saw the Spanish Empire as their biggest rival, so they wanted to bring it down through propaganda. The Dutch, on the other hand, were fighting a war of independence against Spain. So, of course, they deliberately overlooked their own record in the colonies. Now, they, of course, some of the best admirers of the Hispanic legacy are British and American scholars. I mentioned already David Irving. However, the prejudice persists in subtle forms. Unfortunately, educated Filipinos get their information from English language sources only. Another caution, we tend to judge, I'm talking now as an anthropologist. I'm very, I'd like to bring in the role of culture. we tend to judge the pre-modern world using our modern world's cultural norms. Now, we have to realize that the liberal revolutions of the late 19th centuries marks a watershed in universal human history because the principle of unity in the state changed. In the pre-modern world, social hierarchy was accepted as normal. This was the case in the Chinese Empire, the Mughal Empire, and in different kingdoms and empires right in Europe. So, in the Spanish Empire, we should not be surprised to find out that there was a social pyramid um, with people divided according to their origins. Those at the very top with more privileges than those at the bottom. So the Spaniards were at the very top by right of conquest. So they were exempt, for example, from rendering labor in services. Um, then you had the Chinese mestizos, the unbaptized Chinese, and the Indian majority at the very bottom. Chinese mestizos were liable for more taxation because they could pay more. Okay, so it does. In other words, the pre-modern world accepted the notion of a ladder, social ladder, it's a social pyramid. Whereas today, modern world, because of the democratic revolutions, our guiding principle is equality of all before the law, even if it is not really followed always. The idea is of a shared nationality. And indeed, in 1887, the Civil Code was introduced by Spain as part of its modernizing effort. This replaced previous laws. All were now considered Filipinos with the same responsibilities under one law. So even Spaniards born in the Philippines, if they were liable to render some days of labor services if they could not pay in monetary form. So nonetheless, um, throughout these past centuries, there was a counterweight to social racial pyramid in the Spanish Empire. There were intermarriages across racial and linguistic ethnic lines. As I pointed out from the very earliest, there was emphasis on baptism to Catholicism and legal intermarriage. Both formed cornerstones of the Spanish Empire. Despite racial discrimination and social pyramid based on race, intermarriage across racial lines was actually encouraged if the marriage was Catholic. So in 1503, the Spanish crown recognized unions between Spaniards and Amerindians as legitimate if celebrated before the Catholic altar. Then in 1537, the Pope came out with an encyclical declaring that all the new peoples discovered in the Americas were human beings, therefore worthy of conversion rather than of extermination. Um, but what about the so-called limpieza de sangre, purity of blood? This is a rather controversial topic. I hope the historians here can comment on this. Descendants of Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and those tried by the Inquisition could not assume offices in the church and state. But I like from what I know, the issue is really religion and not race. I think when limpieza de sangre is discussed, it has to be situated within the context in 15th and 16th century Spain. After 7 centuries of pushing back Islamic forces, Catholic Spain finally compelled Muslim Granada to surrender in 1492. But there was a new threat. The Muslim Ottoman Empire of the Turks was annexing most of the Mediterranean lands and even part of southeastern Europe by the 16th century. Spain feared being invaded again by Islamic forces. I think they famous French geographer historian Fernand Braudel brings this up in his magnum opus, the Mediterranean and Philip II. So in 1570, there ensued the Battle of Lepanto. There was a huge Ottoman army that sought to conquer Italy, especially Rome. Now, the Protestant North did not help. Even Catholic France did not help. So the Catholic alliance was led by Spain and two principal Italian city-states, Genoa and Venice. Fortunately, they won at Lepanto. Otherwise, the Turkish forces would have overrun all of the peninsula, including Rome, of course. So, and I think that explains the constant fear of mixing with either Jews or Protestants or Muslims. The fear that the empire would be subverted. Whereas according to Antonio Abasalo, a historian located in University of Cordoba, who's been studying this case seriously, he says that actually the cornerstones of the Spanish Empire were two things: acceptance of Catholic religion as the ideology of the realm, because there was union of church and state and intermarriages. So being a mestizo has actually gone through a lot of transformations linguistically that cannot be denied. But today, mestizo simply means a biological condition, but also a culturally induced feeling. Mestizo comes from the Latin word mestitius. The expression mixtus gives us the English word mixtus. Um, Consider the case of the Malaccan Portuguese I mentioned earlier. There was a similar situation that occurred in Portuguese colonies. Intermarriages were recognized as legal when celebrated in church. So Malaccans in Malaysia consider themselves Portuguese in culture because of religion and customs. So current Filipino use of mestizo would exclude them because they don't look white, but they feel Portuguese because of religion and culture. And there's another thing that we have to bear in mind when comparing Catholicism and Protestantism. The use of icons is very important in Catholicism. So in Catholicism, you have this tradition of black Madonnas and black Christs. This is you have our Lady of Montserrat and Our Lady of Guadalupe in Cáceres in southwestern Spain. Notice they're both very, very black. That is because there was tradition in Catholicism of making images black to reflect agrarian conditions. A black soil connotes fertility. And when Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to Juan Diego, Mexican Indian, her image on the cloak was brown, and this was taken as proof for the fact that the divine can also be brown. Um, when the Spaniards came in, a tradition of having black Christs developed throughout Mexico, Guatemala, and other Spanish American countries. Consider, for example, the most popular image of the adult Christ in the Philippines is the Nuestro Señor Jesus Nazareno in Quiapo, which arrived from Mexico in 1605. It's interesting that the first Mexican Republic was headed by an Indio, Benito Juarez, of Zapotec descent. It was he who promoted Spanish as a vehicle of national unity. At that time, Spanish was a minority language right in Mexico City itself, as pointed out by Dr. Cristina Baron Soto, but it was better distributed all over the country. So he promoted Spanish as a vehicle of national unity. This is a photo I took of Mexicans at a bar in Tlaxcala when I last visited. Many Mexicans consider themselves mestizo. Racially, they may have a mixture combining two or three origins: Native American, Indian, African, and European descent. But they consider themselves mestizo. Um, Culturally, Mexican culture today draws from all three origins. It's very interesting that some Mexican scholars, like Doctora Paulina Machuca of Michoacan, now propose a fourth pillar of their identity, the Filipino. But that's for another topic. Now, during the Spanish period, mestizo in the Philippines often meant mestizo de sangley, Chinese father, Filipina mother. Of Spanish mestizos, Spanish father, native Filipina mother were few because of limited Spanish migration. By far, the wealthiest sector of the population were the Chinese mestizos. So, um, this has led to some misunderstandings today. In major towns and cities from the Spanish period, there's a place called Barrio de Mestizos, generally the wealthiest and most prosperous quarter. Now, some people were not familiar with the history of vegan, think this was reserved for Spanish mestizos. It was not. It was actually where families of Chinese and native India descent lived. And it's interesting that in vegan, they have another term for it, kasanglayan. It's a giveaway. That's where the people of Sanglay descent lived. So in Malolos, Cebu City, and Iloilo City, the names are also giveaways. Pariancillo, Parian, Parian. So, so in vegan for today, this is where the Singson, Sikya, Kema, and Ichon come from. Another example of mixing Chinese Spanish native unions. Benito Lagarda Ituason was the heir administrator of the vast Tuason estate, which used to cover part of Quezon City and Marikina, including what are now La Vista and Ateneo. This is Benito Lagarda Ituason. The Lagardas were migrants from northeastern Spain. Antonio Tuason was a Chinese mestizo who founded the estate with his wealth from the galleon trade. He bought Jesuit lands sold at auction. Now, because he had been active in fighting the British, he raised a militia. The Spanish crown gave him and his family a title of nobility. This is the coat of arms of the Familia Tuason, which they still carry today. Now, Spanish migrants, Legardas, Roches, and Arenetas, intermarried in his succeeding lineage. It's very interesting when you talk about so-called Spanish families in the Philippines. You will notice they're not actually pure Spanish. There's a lot of intermixing. Now, I think a source of confusion in the Philippines has been Rizal's Noli Me Tangere. Yes, Maria Clara, the heroine, was the daughter of a friar called Damaso and her mother, Pia, a native Filipina. But did Rizal say that all mestizos are bastards? The hero is actually Crisostomo Ibarra. Ibarra was the fourth generation descendant of a Spaniard with a family name Ibermandia, shortened to Ibarra. In other words, from the Basque country in northeastern Spain. Now, according to the novel, he was actually fourth generation uh, Spanish mestizo, Filipino. All his ancestors married in native women in church. That is implied in Rizal. In other words, Rizal doesn't say he was a bastard. It's interesting to note that there was, of course, bickering between races in 19th century Philippines, bickering for places of honor. But In 1859, Sir John Boring, the British consul of Hong Kong, wrote that in Manila, the lines of separation between ranks and classes were less marked and impassable than in most Oriental countries. I've seen at the same table Spaniard, Mestizo, and Indian, British civilian, and soldier. Um, it's uncanny, but Rizal's Noli Me Tangere opens precisely with a banquet, where again the same mixing is so evident in the guests he describes at the famous banquet at the house of Santiago de los Santos, located in Binondo. And note also that you cannot really talk about segregation in Manila, because an 1840 government report stated that half of the residents in the walled city or Intramuros de Manila were Indios and Chinese mestizos. They had more than 100 houses and were in the colleges, the consular seminary, 16 holdings, and four lots where they were packed together. Because by that time, many wealthy Spanish families were actually migrating north of the Pasig to build villas along the river in the then independent municipalities of Santa Cruz, Quiapo, and San Miguel. San Miguel was particularly attractive because the Capitan General, the Governor General, installed his palace there after the 1863 earthquake. It's interesting to note the eulogy paid by three British historians to Manila in 1941. Manila quite singularly embraced not only Southeast and East Asia, Europe and North America, but thanks to Spanish influence, significant elements of Latin America. So these are family names in the Philippines today. You have Scottish Irish, Italian, French, Arab, German, plenty of German in fact, Greek, and some Scandinavian family names. Now, I was talking with a Hungarian friend, married to a Thai woman. I asked him, why are you settling in Manila? Because he said, if you live in Bangkok, there would be no place for our children. But in the Philippines, there would be place for our children. So I would like to conclude. So what term to use? Mestizo, hybrid, or polymodal? Listening to video video discussions online, I noticed that mestizo is now a problematic term in Mexico itself. Now, it is true, of course, that after 1910, after the Mexican Social Revolution, Mexican authors popularized mestizo to characterize their diverse genetic and cultural heritage. American Indian, European, African. There's, of course, that famous inscription at Tlatelolco, at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, about this is where Cuauhtemoc, the last emperor of the Aztec Empire, fell. This was neither a victory nor a defeat. It was the birth of the mestizo nation that is Mexico today. So one was mestizo regardless of skin color, because it was above all a feeling of sentiment. But I notice Indians in the mountains, like the Huicholes, refuse to be called mestizo, even if their culture is mixed. So they're wearing pants, which was not originally indigenous. They're wearing shirts, not originally indigenous, and they're playing on stringed instruments, not indigenous either. But they refuse to be called mestizo, and indeed they avoid the mestizos, white or brown, partake in the mainstream mestizo culture. In other words, those are Spanish speaking, Catholic, educated in schools. And I pointed out that mestizo is problematic in the Philippines since the shift to English. So most Filipinos identify mestizo with being mostly Spanish or looking white. So your tisoy meaning mestizo Filipino, therefore white, versus Chinoy, Chinese Filipino versus Pinoy, pure Filipino. Rather confusing. So, what am I suggesting? How about polymodal? I've been playing with the term lately. I brought this out in my recent book, Insular Yet Global. I draw from both music and chemistry. In contemporary musical theory, Bela Bartok used polymodality to refer to the use of different modes simultaneously using the same tonic. Now, I think musicologists can explain this much better, but I was struck by this discussion in a dissertation on music that I was reading. In chemistry, polymodality is an experience activated by a wide variety of stimuli, whether chemical, mechanical, or heat. So the common denominator is that difference does not sound negative, as it does in both syncretism and hybridity. Both concepts acknowledge identity and difference, but they deal with difference uneasily. This is not the case with polymodality, which either assumes difference as a fact in chemistry or as a source of originality in music, because Bela Bartok deliberately cultivated different modes simultaneously for more coloration. So, an image is a cultural symbol capable of bringing several meanings that do not always harmonize with each other. There can be contradictions because different ways of interpreting reality coexist within a culture. Let us not think of culture as monolithic. It's not. You can combine different traditions in culture because the fact that culture is dynamic, it influences and is influenced. So here are takeaways and suggestions. Intermarriage across racial and ethnic lines, when solemnized in a church wedding, was recognized by the Spanish crown. This in contrast to the situation in Anglo-American countries until fairly recently, where legal prohibitions existed. What was discouraged were unions with non-Catholics, specifically Protestants, Jews, Muslims. The term mestizo simply means someone or something of mixed racial or ethnic origin. Unfortunately, English translations are often negative. Perhaps a new term may be needed, perhaps polymodal. So here are two suggestions. Short term, it would be good to work on a joint paper on alternative terms to use to mestizo or mestizaje. With a biological anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, historians, and a musicologist, I suggested this in fact to Chicotencatel Pinzon, and he's enthusiastic. I have to look for musicologists to join. And of course, I'd like to invite historians to join. Long term, I think we need a textbook on a shared history between Mexico, Philippines, and Spain, involving scholars from all three countries. Over the past 20 years, there have been wonderful articles, books written on the shared tradition between these countries. But I noticed this research is not reaching the public. In the Philippines, the old stereotypes persist, which are very harmful. So we need a textbook, obviously bilingual, in Spanish and English, that everybody can use. Because right now, there's a lot of important knowledge that is disparate, scattered in journals, which ordinary people, of course, do not have access to. So I suggest eventually working towards a shared textbook. With that, gracias, salamat po. Thank you.
Thank you so much po, Dr. Fernando, for that very informative presentation.
Mhm.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for your questions and comments. Yes, Sir Ignacio Nieto, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Dr. Cialcita. Thank you so much for a high-level lecture. It's very refreshing to listen to someone like you. It gives me the impression that you have the privilege to navigate between the scholarly from the Spanish-speaking world and the English-speaking world. And of course, that gives you a perspective that perhaps we don't have here in Mexico. And when I say we don't have, I don't talk about the, let's call it the Historia de Bronce, what we call in Mexico the Historia de Bronce, which is basically the history that we teach to the children. So, you know, the heroes, the bad guys, the villains, and something like that. Obviously, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the high level of scholarly, something that we're supposed to find in the UNNAM or in the Colmex. And even there, I think sometimes they lack what you offer us here. And again, that comes from your ability to navigate between these, let's call it English scholarly and Spanish scholarly. And of course, you are able to transcend this leyenda negra. More than a question is a comment, and in this spirit to check the terms, to revise, not to deconstruct. I don't really like this concept, but to make a revision, the same thing that you are proposing now. Speaking about Americas, and the term Americas, perhaps is something that curiously we know very well here in Mexico. But in the Spanish-speaking sources, they don't, especially in the sources from the United States. America is a continent, and in this continent we can find several countries. Of course, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. I guess we cannot avoid that. And yes, this idea that America is a continent, not really something like Americas. What is that? Perhaps when we have this idea, something that they believe, some people who believe that they live in America and that America is for them, and America is for the Americans. Yes, but who are the Americans? The people who live between the Rio Bravo and between the border with Canada. Obviously, that leads to confusions, and as we all see now, that also can cause some problems. they think that they own what they actually don't belong to them. And just another comment about Benito Juarez. Benito Juarez was definitely, he was the first. I will stall your term. The first, how you call it, polymodality or polymodal president in Mexico. Definitely he was. But he was not definitely the first president of the very first Mexican Republic.
Correct. Yeah.
There were other guys before him. And actually, we have an emperor before him. And actually, we have an emperor who was contemporary to him, who was fighting for he was fighting for the government here in Mexico. So that was just a clarification.
Thank you.
Again,
thank you for the correction.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the clarifications. Actually, when I refer to the people of United States, I don't refer to them as Americano. I always refer to them as Estadounidense from the United States. I want to make that very clear because everybody on the American continent is an Americano technically. And thank you for clarifying that point about Benito Juarez. I was thinking of him actually as a president of the republic because Iturbide, of course, was an emperor.
And Guadalupe Victoria, he was the very first president of Mexico. Thank you so much again. Salamat po, Dr. Salcita.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Ignacio. Dr. Fernando, we do have several questions in the chat box. One from Mr. Anthony Deputado. Is it true that many of the Macabebes of Pampanga trace their ancestry from Mexico, which is the reason they were chosen by the Spaniards and as an exclusive brigandine, the Spanish colonial army? And his second question is Is there a historic origin in the naming of the town of Mexico, Pampanga, in relation to our links with Mexico?
Well, I have to look at the matter more closely no, because I'm not that, because Pampanga has its own history. I'm not sure. This actually the special allies of the Spaniards when they came to the Philippines were actually the people of Tlaxcala, Tlaxcaltecas. When talk about Spaniards, Spanish troops landing the Philippines, they're people from Tlaxcala, Tlaxcaltecas. Now, about people in Mexico, Mexico Pampanga. First of all, the term Mexico comes from the word Mexico, which means a curve in the river. It doesn't mean Mexico. It became Mexico, but actually it's Mexico in Kapampangan. Now, I think their loyalty is not simply it's not because they came from Mexico. I don't think there's basis for that. In fact, originally the Macabebes fought hard against Spanish domination. But I think it was, remember, in those days, there was nationality was not the issue. It was a feudal hierarchic order. So they saw that the fealty, the obedience they paid to the Spanish crown served their interests, and vice versa. The Spaniards saw um, benefits to the alliance with the people of Macabebe. I don't think I'm not sure, but I don't think it has anything to do with coming from Mexico. No.
Thank you, Sir Fernando. Next question, sir, is coming from Mark Ritchie, Celsius Cuento Huachon, Dr. Zialcita. Thank you so much for the presentation. Can present Filipino identity ever be authentic? Or is hybridity slash polymodality itself the true authenticity born from the Gallian world? Number two, how has the discourse of Asian versus Western impacted the deeper trans-Pacific nature of Filipino cultural identity? And last question, does the celebration of fusion culture risk erasing indigenous and marginalized identity that never fully entered the Gallian world?
Thank you very much for those questions. Um, First of all, I just want to point out that this issue of polymodality doesn't affect only the Philippines. It affects other cultures as well. Um, People are not aware of this, but there's a similar situation in Vietnam as regards Chinese influence, because the authe- indigenous culture in Vietnam, which is so similar to the indigenous culture in the Philippines and the rest of the Austronesian world, was was overcome by Chinese influence because the Chinese colonized Vietnam for 1,000 years. They deliberately tried to uproot many native Vietnamese traditions that seemed incompatible with the Chinese. So the Vietnamese accepted Chinese influences, but over time they tried to recover what they originally had lost. For example, originally the Vietnamese were bilateral in kinship like Filipinos. But the Chinese imposed patrilineality. Only the men could inherit. But it's interesting to know that over the past 2 centuries, bilaterality has again returned because the Vietnamese insisted that daughters should also have the privilege of inheriting and owning property. Now, it's very interesting to note that in Vietnam right now, there's deep interest in recovering also the indigenous tradition. So, Vietnam, like the Philippines, actually has a double answer to its former colonizer. So in Vietnam, you cannot be an official unless you stand up against the Chinese. But you also cannot be an official against unless you make friends with the Chinese. So on the one hand, they affirmed their connection with China. On the other hand, they're increasingly affirming their indigenous past, which is not Chinese. And I think it's the same problem of aspect in the Philippines, same situation in the Philippines. Nick Joaquin, probably our most famous author in English, pointed out that actually our response to Spanish influence is actually a yes and a no. Yes, we're Catholics, but also pagans. Yes, we're pro-Spanish, but also anti-Spanish. So I think this is not proper only to the Philippines. Now, what makes the Philippine situation a bit more complicated is this: it is in Asia, okay, not in America. Unfortunately, there's this bad habit of thinking of continents, which are basically just geographical definitions on the map, as having a soul. So there's supposed to be an Asian soul, an Southeast Asian soul. So people think it weird that Filipinos, being Asians, should also have a Latin American connection. But these are just constructs. There is nothing that says that we should not have a Latin American connection. So we are geographically in Asia, but that doesn't necessarily mean all influences should come only from Asia. It doesn't make sense. So that's my answer.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Ms. Jen Zaragoza. Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. Professor Zialcita, my questions are, why is the shared history largely absent from the mainstream narratives of both countries? During my brief stay in Mexico, I was both sad and happy to know that the modern Mexicans know Pacquiao rather than our shared history through the Manila-Acapulco trade. Is there a proactive or an aggressive effort by both countries to improve this?
Well, I don't know. I have to qualify that. I notice among the educated Mexicans, there's a bit more knowledge about our shared history. I don't sense that among educated Filipinos. Um, this is complicated in the Philippines by the estadounidense presence, American influence. There was a deliberate attempt to blacken the Spanish legacy during the Spanish period. This has been documented in a recent study, by the way. So, so there's still this antipathy, even towards acknowledging Mexican influence. That's why words like mongrel keep surfacing among educated Filipinos. Now, of course, more can be done to create mutual understanding. That's why suggesting a common textbook would really be would help change the climate, because right now there's a lot of important research being done, but these are in journals which are not accessible to the public.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we do have another question from Ms. Fatima Araneta. Dr. Zelcita, if you have time, please give us your take on the phrase mejorar la raza and the abundance of skin whitening products and
Oh yeah.
makeup lips.
Yeah, of course. Precisely because of the racial hierarchy. Thank you, Fatima. I know your mother quite well. Um, of course, because of the racial hierarchy, white was considered better than dark, because white meant um, you came from the upper strata, you were refined, educated. So there was that prejudice. But as I said, there were no legal barriers. That is an important distinction to make. And about skin whitening, well, the reality is it's not true only the Philippines. All over Southeast Asia, even in Thailand, which was never colonized, there's a preference for white skin. Um, it has to do again with the distinction between manual versus mental. So in other words, if you're white, that means you've never worked the fields. That means you come from an elite family. So that is why even in Thailand, which was never colonized, there's a preference for white-skinned women. And I notice in Mindanao, Muslims, of course, were not colonized as much as we in Luzon, Visayas. There used to be, rather, a special place in the houses called lamin, where the daughters of elite families would be secluded to keep them away from the sun, because they would be more desirable for marriage than if you were dark. Because if you're dark, that meant you're outside working the fields.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, just to answer some of the requests from our participants,
Hmm.
those who would like to revisit this session, the video will be available at the Philippine Embassy's YouTube page, Mexico PE. So
Hmm.
please refer to that channel to review this session. And I'd like to call on Miss Maria Cristina. You're raising your hand, ma'am.
Ay, wonderful, wonderful.
Okay. Uh, First of all, congratulations, Fernando. You are really in your proposal. Actually, I think that your proposal text will is I would like to talk to you more about it. When we write it together, you and me. Did you hear my comment? Excuse me. Did you hear my comment?
I'm sorry, Miss Maria Cristina, your signal is a bit weak and we couldn't really understand your comment, ma'am. Can you please just type it in the chat box so I can read it, ma'am?
Okay, I will do it.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to call on Mr. Ricardo Pinzon. Sir, you have the floor. Sir Ricardo, you just have to go to your to the lower left of your screen that says audio and unmute yourself. Okay, so while we wait for
Hola,
there he is.
Ah,
Sir,
can
there
you
you
hear
are.
me?
Sure, sure, sure.
Un gusto verte, Fernando.
Gracias, Ricardo.
I totally agree with you that we have to start working on collaborate on a new text that addresses the problems that we have about the use of mestizaje in everywhere. I think it's being misused, but I also think that my job right now is to bring to the table the other information that is missing in this worldwide mestizaje, especially in Mexico, Guam, and the Philippines. So in Mexico, until recently, mestizaje was just about the Europeans and natives, and it was throughout the last decade that it started to be recognized the African part of the Mexican mestizaje, and I am going up the hill trying to demonstrate how Oriental Asian Malay Filipino is also part of our genetic fabric. So definitely you can count on me, Fernando, and hopefully others here can join in this effort. Uh,
Mm,
so just we can probably email and start working on an agenda, but you're right, and I am happy that you are giving this presentation, and it's very enlightening, and we should continue working as a team on both sides of the oceans.
thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Ricardo.
thank you, Sir Ricardo, for that comment. Sir Tiburcio, I think I saw you raising your hand earlier. Sir? Sir, kindly unmute yourself, sir. Please unmute yourself. Thank you. Sir, you can look at the lower left of your screen that says audio, and there should be an arrow. Click on that arrow and just click unmute. There you, sir, you're unmute already. You may speak.
Buenos días, Señor Don Fernando Shalcita,
Buenos días también.
on catedrático de una universidad en la ciudad capitalina de Filipinas. Y antes que nada, permítame presentarme. Soy de la Norteña Party de Mindanao, aquí en Cagayan de Oro. Me gradué del bachillerato de filosofía y también del derecho. Fui una lectura in Olvidada y repasadura. Porque Filipinas y México, la historia de Filipinas y la de México se entrelazan. Me recuerda de la narrativa histórica de Teodoro Agoncillo, el escritor o el autor de un libro titulado History of the Philippines. Me recuerda del Tratado de Tordesillas, del navegador Miguel de Ordanita de España, que dio a conocer o el hombre que reconoció la ruta Tornavieja, que empieza desde la bahía de Manila, desde ahí a rumbo de un mar entre Ticao y Masbate, y después rumbo al estrecho tan traicionero, el estrecho de San Bernardino, un estrecho entre Matnog o la norteña parte de Samar y la suriña parte de Bicol. Y desde allí la ruta procede o siguió hasta la norteña parte de Taiwán. Y desde allí siguió la ruta hasta la parte de Japón. Y desde allí el rumbo hacia el Acapulco. Este viaje o esta ruta marcó el comienzo de la globalización. Digamos, esta ruta, esta actividad mercantil que lo conocimos como galeón, el galeón de Acapulco o la nao de China o el galeón de Manila, marcó el punto de inflexión, porque desde esta ruta comenzó la globalización. Muy buenos, gracias, señor Don Fernando Shalcita, por esta lectura inolvidada y repasadora.
Thank you very much for your comment. Yeah. The galleon trade was indeed the beginning of globalization, but not the globalization, different from the globalization that begins in the 1850s, which is capitalist. This one is mercantile, and it connects all the continents together for the first time.
Thank you, Sir Tiburcio, for those comments. Sir, I will take note of the comment of Miss Beatrice and Dolores. She would like to work with you. So
sure.
if you give her email address, and if you haven't,
Oh, I know her personally, so
oh,
yeah,
okay, so that's good,
not a
sir.
problem. Yeah.
And then I'll just like to read the message of Miss Maria Cristina earlier because of
Yeah,
her internet. She said that
that's good,
they
that's good.
think your proposal to write a textbook of this shared history is very interesting, and she would like to talk to you more about it. And I'd like to call out now Mr. Tomas Calvillo, sir.
Thank you, thank you. Fernando, ya se va esa nao de Manila, esa nao que se lleva mi amor, una flor que en sus labios destila elixir de fragancia y dolor, corazón dolorido que llora por la dulce extranjera que se va, aunque diga mi amada que me adora, a su tierra peregrina se irá. Desdichado que soy, me consuelo, contemplando la vista en redor, el fantástico lienzo del cielo y los cambios granel de color. Son destellos prismáticos que alumbran cielo tornasolado sin igual, que a los ojos mortales deslumbran por su grande belleza irreal. Cielo caleidoscópico que encierra la pantalla cinemática de color, donde sombras quiméricas de la tierra fantasean con mágico ardor. Cuando el día atardece inquietante, cuando el sol se desangra al morir, sigo errando en busca de mi amante, suspirando sin afán de vivir. Va arrancando un suspiro que mi aliento, cada legua que se aleja de mí, esa nao que se lleva por el viento, que enrojece en la mar carmesí, recargado de rico tesoro de la China, de la India y del Japón, con brocados de plata y de oro, perlas, prendas de mucha atracción, corazón dolorido que llora por la dulce extranjera que amé, aunque diga la ingrata que me adora, a su tierra peregrina se fue. Ya me muero en mortal desconsuelo, gime el enamorado que soñó, desquiciado es el hombre en su duelo que por vana ilusión desveló. Gracias, Fernando.
Thank you. Thank you. Gracias, Tomas. That poem was actually written by my father, who who was a medical doctor. He was a radiologist, but he never forgot his love as a young man for writing poetry in Spanish. So when he retired, he decided to come out with more poems in Spanish. So he came out with a book. This is one of the more beautiful poems that Tomas read. It's about the Galleon of Manila. What he does is to give it a very human touch. It's about um, a man and his fiancée separated because of the ship. And the ship sails against the Manila sunset as it leaves Manila Bay. Thank you, thank you. It's a book, like Lanao de Manila y otras poesías. Hilario Shalcita y Lagarda.
Yeah. Así es. Beautiful. Bello.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Thomas, for reading that beautiful poem. I think that's all the time we have, folks, for the questions and answer portion of our
Yes,
session.
may I just say thank you, Christina. Yeah, we really need to create a collaborative project that will be duradera, that will last, that will bring together all the new information that has been gathered over the past 20 years. Make the textbook available to all.
Okay, sir, Dr. Fernando,
Yes.
I'll be closing the floor now to the questions and comments. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your active participation to everyone here in Zoom as well as in YouTube. And at this point, I would like to request everyone to please indulge the Philippine Embassy here in Mexico to for a quick group photo.
Oh, nice.
Please turn on your cameras and I'll be the one to take the photo.
Wait, I don't know how
Maybe a
to
couple of
open.
seconds.
Wait. It's open.
Okay, is everyone ready? Smile, everybody. Uno, dos, tres. Let me just get the other page. Uno, dos, tres. Uno, dos, tres. Thank you very much, everybody. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to call on Ms. Marissa R. Winkler, Third Secretary and Vice Consul of the Philippine Embassy here in Mexico, for the closing remarks. Vice Consul?
Thank you, NJ. On behalf of the Philippine Embassy in Mexico, I would like to thank Dr. Fernando N. Salcieta for the very insightful lecture, The Mixed Unions During the Spanish Period. His presentation deepened our understanding of how intercultural encounters with Spain, Mexico, and other countries during the Spanish periods helped shape the Filipino identity. And yes, it would be wonderful to have a textbook on the shared history between the Philippines, Mexico, and Spain. Such collaboration would enrich our collective understanding and appreciation of our intertwined heritage. And to our participants, maraming salamat and see you next month. Happy weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Salamat
Thank
po.
you,
Happy
Maritza.
weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
very
much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Fernando.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.